Today we're going to answer the question I have been flooded with after my last video, which is outdoor sports shooting. If you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend checking that video out before this one. And the question I've been getting is, so how do we do indoor sports shooting and have a lot of success? First, I want to say this is probably one of the more common questions I get is about indoor photography. And I know it's very frustrating. You've spent all this money on a great camera, you put that kit lens on there, you're out shooting your outdoor sports photography, and you walk indoors and you try to take pictures just like you were a second ago, and none of the images are coming out. You're having all kinds of problems and it's blurry, and you think, well, maybe it's the camera, what am I doing wrong? And I want you guys to know, first of all, it's not your fault. This is something we all struggle with, and it's not the camera's fault. This is physics. When we're shooting outdoors, we have the sun, which is a tremendous light source. When we walk indoors, we're typically shooting off fluorescent lights, and especially at a high school gym, terrible lighting conditions. There's not enough light in there, and we have to take a different approach in order to pull this off. Now, some of you are going to email me and say, well, what about all the pictures I see in Sports Illustrated? Indoor professional sports arenas are lit pretty well. In fact, if you were to go on the sideline of a professional basketball game, you would have a lot more success than if you were shooting your son's high school game, just because there's more light. To make the problem a little bit more complex, most indoor sports will not allow you to use flash because it would interfere with the players playing, and a lot of them will not allow you to set up a tripod or a monopod to hold the camera still. So the question is, how are you able to take great indoor sports pictures? And that's what I'm going to address now. The first consideration that you have to think about is your lens. The kit lenses typically have a very small maximum aperture, and they are not wide enough to let light in. What this means is if you're serious about this, you're going to have to invest some money in a very good piece of glass. The dream lens for indoor sports photographers is Canon's 200mm 2.0 lens. The problem with that lens is it costs $6,000. So it's going to be outside of pretty much all of our budgets. The second best lens, in my opinion, would be Canon's 70-200 2.8 image stabilized L2 lens. And this lens is also very expensive at about $2,500. Now, there is a version 1 model that you can find on eBay, typically for anywhere between $1,400 to $1,700. That lens is very, very good, and it is also image stabilized, which is going to help with any camera shake. Another lens that you might want to consider is Canon's 135mm 2.0 prime lens. Now, that lens is a fixed prime lens. There's no zoom, which means all of your shots are going to have the same focal length. The strength about that lens, it is going to let in 2 times the amount of light as an f2.8 lens. So it is a very good low light lens, but you can't zoom. Tamron also makes a 70-200 2.8 lens that has very high reviews and is considered an excellent value, and that runs about $770. Now, something that I don't know about the sport that you're shooting is how close you are allowed to get to the action. You're also going to want to consider something like the 24-70 2.8. Now, there's a version 1 and there's a version 2. The version 2 is also pretty expensive. It's over $2,000. The older version, you can find those on eBay for about $1,500. And there is also a Tamron version that's very good and a Sigma version that is also pretty good for its value. For you crop sensor users, so if you're using a Rebel or a 50D or a 60D or maybe the 7D, there is also the 17-55 2.8. Just remember that is for crop sensors only, and it will not work on a full frame. Any of those lenses are going to put you in pretty good shape. I know that Sigma used to make a 70-200 non-image stabilized lens. You might be able to find that on eBay in the $500 or $600 range, but I would try to go for either the 70-200 2.8 or the 135 2.0. Now, some of you are going to ask, well, what about the 35 1.4, the 50 millimeter 1.2, or the 85 millimeter 1.2? And I would say, when you start getting to an aperture of f1.4, you have a very shallow depth of field, and it's going to be very difficult for the focusing system on some of those lenses to grab the action right where you want the focal plane. That 85 1.2, its focus is a little slow. It's not really meant for sports shooting. And even if you could stop the action, so much of it's going to be out of focus that it's going to look a little weird. Now let me throw you out a tip. A lot of people don't know this, but B&H Photo will let you buy a lens and try it out for 2 weeks. If you don't like it, you can return the lens and they will refund your money. Obviously you got to pay for shipping, but that is a really good way to try lenses out. Something to consider. A second very important consideration when you're shooting indoors is the distance from you to your subjects, and also the amount of shake that is being introduced to the camera. If you're holding the camera away from your body, there's going to be shake in your arms, and if you're standing, there is going to be shake in the way your body moves around. You don't feel it, but we're always moving around like this. Something you can do is to try to find a solid structure you can either lean against or kind of put your arms against, and that is going to reduce camera shake. I know it doesn't sound like a big deal, but if your subject's 100 feet or 200 feet away and you move the camera just a little teeny tiny bit, it is going to affect the image. We have to reduce the amount of movement in the camera. The third most important consideration that you should think of is your camera's ISO noise. We want to have low amounts of noise when we're shooting at higher ISOs. The Canon 5D Mark III is very, very good. Even at 1600, even at 3200, it's not that bad. Whereas some other cameras like the 7D, which does phenomenally outdoors, it struggles a little bit with its ISO noise, and that's going to introduce a lot of grain. So if you can get a camera that has high ISO noise, you are going to be in very good shape. So those first three considerations are very important. Let's talk about camera settings. I have two strategies I recommend for indoor sports shooting. The first is to use the aperture priority mode. And this is going to sound a little counterintuitive. Open up your lens as wide as it will go, preferably at least 2.8. Take a shot and look at your shutter speed. If the shutter speed's too slow, like 1/60th or 1/80th of a second, start bumping up your ISO until you get a shutter speed of 1/250th, maybe 1/320th, 1/500th of a second. And just take a look at the images and see if that shutter speed is fast enough to freeze the action. Now it's going to depend on the type of sport you're shooting. Small children playing are not going to need a very, very fast shutter speed like something like grown men sprinting. So it does depend on the sport, but that aperture priority mode and bumping your ISO up gradually is a very, very good way to lock your aperture in and still get a fast enough shutter speed. A second strategy you're going to want to try, and I have a lot of friends that do this, is they shoot on manual mode. They dial in their aperture and their shutter speed, and they turn their ISO to automatic. And what this does is it gives the camera permission to change the ISO settings in order to make that shutter speed and that aperture happen. You do have to be careful with this because you don't want your ISO jumping up into H1 or H2 too often. It's going to ruin the image. But if you can find a shutter speed where your ISO is, hovering around 800 or 1600, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. Again, it depends on the camera. Let's talk about our other camera settings. AI Servo is the focus mode you want to use. It is a predictive tracking focus. One shot in AI focus modes are not ideal for sports. I like to use the high-speed bursts, which is going to give you your maximum frames per second. I typically shoot with the evaluative metering mode simply because we're not dealing with very bright highlights outdoors. And something else I prefer to do for indoor shooting is I shoot on RAW, the RAW format. The reason I do this, there's a couple reasons. Number one, all of your white balance information is retained. Sometimes when we're shooting indoors, we have mixed lighting. Maybe incandescent light, fluorescent light, maybe we have some sunlight coming in. It can get really crazy when you're indoors. RAW format will allow you to correct that easily. I also like to shoot RAW for this last tip I'm going to give you, and that is if you get into a situation where your ISO is maxed out, your aperture is maxed out, and your shutter speed is maxed out, and let's say you're at maybe 1/250th of a second, and you're right at the point where it's almost freezing the action, but not quite. A trick you can do is to underexpose the image by 1 stop. So if you're on aperture priority mode, you're going to move that tick mark down to -1. If you're shooting at 1/250th of a second and you underexpose it by 1 stop, that is going to allow you to shoot at 1/500th of a second, and that might be enough to freeze the action. Now, when you're taking the pictures, the image is going to look a little underexposed. But if you are shooting RAW, that is very easy to correct in post-processing. I typically don't like to give that recommendation, but I understand in indoor sports shooting, you got to really try to get everything you can out of your images and the amount of light you have. Now, I know some of you are not going to like that tip, but trust me, if you ever get in a situation where you don't have enough light, you can always underexpose it 1 stop. You're probably going to be in good shape. It's just not something I recommend that beginners do because it might confuse them or whatnot. So in conclusion, in order to get great results for indoor sports photography, there are a few considerations. We have to use a wide aperture lens. We have to reduce the amount of shake and motion while we're holding the camera because that's going to come into play. And it also really helps to have a camera with low, high ISO noise. The 2 strategies are to shoot on aperture priority with a wide aperture and to gradually increase your ISO until the shutter speed is fast enough to capture the action. Another strategy is to dial in your aperture and shutter speed on your manual modes and turn on automatic ISO, and the camera will make those adjustments by itself. I hope this information is useful and helpful, and if you guys have more questions, just send them my way, and if I like the question, I will definitely make a video on it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. If you found this video helpful, you may be interested in my new DVD, Lighting Crash Course, where I will teach you one of the most effective, comprehensive courses on portrait and product lighting available anywhere. You can order it from the following link.